We're just waiting a moment as some more people filter in from the waiting room. So we'll get started in just a minute. And as we're getting right up to 105, we're going to go ahead and get started. So thank you everyone for coming to the Statewide Transportation Improvement Fund Formula Program 25-27 Grant Solicitation Training. My name is Ben Goldberg. I am the STIF Program Coordinator, and along with Angie Jones, Regional Transit Coordinator, I'll be presenting the training today. We also have some other ODOT staff assisting. Jennifer Boardman will be helping with questions along with Drew Orr, and we have some other staff here as well. And next slide, please. So just a couple of notes on the logistics of today's meeting before we get going. Today's webinar is being recorded. And the recording, along with the slides, we plan to post to ODOT's funding opportunity page in the STIF Formula section on our website after we're done today. We are asking if you have questions as the meeting is going along, to put those into the Q&A section of the Zoom, and we will then address those questions at the end. We will have a period for questions at the end of the meeting, and if you have questions, if you could please raise your hand so we can address you. So you can submit questions in writing, or you can wait until the end to ask those live. So please, you can ask questions along the way, but if you'd like to ask a question verbally, save that for the end. Next slide, please. So the goal for today's training is that this training, along with other materials that we've prepared, can help you to develop and then submit STIF plans that are complete and meet all of the requirements of the rules so that they're ready to be approved by the OTC. Now, in our training today, we're going to discuss the background of solicitation, the STIF plan form, and highlight some changes from 23-25 so that you're ready to submit your application. Next slide, please. I would like to point out a couple of resources, and we'll refer to these additional times throughout our training today, but these are the Statewide Transportation Improvement Fund and Statewide Transportation Network Guidebook, along with the application instructions for the 25-27 STIF formula solicitation. So please use those materials as you're developing your plans. Next slide, please. So some of our objectives today. We're going to hopefully provide you with an understanding of our funding structure and funding availability. We're going to talk about who is eligible to apply for STIF formula funding and what kinds of projects are eligible. We're going to summarize our key upcoming dates so that to make sure everybody is aware of those. And then we're going to do a review of the Cognito form, highlighting some changes from the last biennium. And then we'll talk about our review process, some additional resources, and also pull out a few things that we'd like to emphasize out of today's training. Next slide, please. But here is a brief outline of our training presentation. So that you can see that these are the sections we're going to move through as we're going through the rest of the presentation today. And remember, we will have time for questions at the end. So just we were going to start with an overview of the STIF formula program. Next slide, please. So the STIF, Statewide Transportation Improvement Fund, was first created in 2017 by House Bill 2017. It's primarily funded by a 0.1% payroll tax, and the goal of the program is to provide a dedicated funding source for improving, maintaining, and expanding public transportation for all users in the state of Oregon. After allocations are made for projects of statewide significance and program administration, 90% of STIF funding goes into the formula program that we're talking about today. The remaining pieces of the formula program, the discretionary and intercommunity, receive 5% and 4% respectively. And then there's a 1% allocation to the Technical Resource Center. Next slide, please. The formula program is broken down into two separate funding streams. There is the population formula, which is roughly 10% of funding, although that's not an exact number. That funding has to be used for services for older adults and individuals with disabilities. The population formula was added into the STIF program when STIF was, I guess, integrated, or when the STF, or Special Transportation Fund, was incorporated into STIF through Senate Bill 1601 in 2023, which came into effect in 2023. There is also then the payroll formula that makes up the large majority of STIF formula funding. And payroll funds may be used for any eligible transit expense. And an important thing we want to emphasize is that payroll funding can be used for services for older adults and people with disabilities. So that is not a restriction. It is a mandate for the population funding, but it is not a restriction on payroll funding. There is also a requirement that 1% of STIF formula funds on a yearly basis be spent on transit services for students in grades 9 through 12. Next slide, please. So next, we want to provide, and this has been circulated through the Gov delivery for the advance notice, but make sure everyone aware is of our funding estimate for the upcoming biennium, that number of $243.4 million. I also wanted to flag for people who may have questions that Drew Orr, our program services manager, is available to provide more information and answer questions about the funding estimate and related budgeting. So please feel free to include those in the Q&A or save them for the end. Next slide, please. So next, we're going to talk about eligibilities for STIF formula program. Next slide, please. So eligible applicants, as I'm sure many people here are aware, only qualified entities, or QEs, are eligible to submit STIF plans and receive STIF formula funding directly from ODOT. Other agencies can request funding as subrecipients. They will do so by submitting projects to the QE's STIF advisory committees for review and approval by the QE. Those projects become part of the qualified entity's STIF plan. Now, there is the optional subrecipient project application form, which is available once again during this solicitation. Just to make clear, that application is to be used to capture information about subrecipient projects that are reviewed and approved by the QE. It is not a separate application process, and so subrecipients who submit those applications are not applying to us for funding. They are still receiving their funding through their QE. So it is not a separate application. It is part of the larger STIF plan, effectively, and will be then it will be part of what the OTC approves. Next slide, please. So project eligibility. There is broad eligibility for projects in STIF formula. These can include a wide variety of project types including but not limited to operations, capital projects, planning, program administration, and program reserves. To be eligible, a project, though, must originate in a compliant local plan. So that means that the project must initially appear or must appear in a local plan that meets the rules of the STIF program. And as the QE is applying, they will have to identify that plan and show us down to the page number of where that project can be found in the plan. I also wanted to highlight here that under our guidance, it is and has been, but it remains permissible to rely on more than one plan if that's necessary to meet the requirements of the STIF program rules. There are a couple of types of projects that have limited eligibility. One of those are client-only projects. Those are projects that serve a defined group of people rather than the general public. Those kind of projects are eligible only if they are part of a planned and coordinated community transportation program. Next, there is limited eligibility for bicycle and pedestrian projects. Those projects must have either a physical or functional relationship to transit to be eligible to receive funding. Having a physical or functional relationship to transit means a bicycle project must be within a 3-mile radius of a transit station or bus stop, and a pedestrian project must be within a half-mile radius. If a bicycle or pedestrian project is beyond those distances, to be eligible, there must be a demonstration that the improvement is within the distance that people will be willing to travel by foot or bicycle to use a particular station or stop. Finally, a few restrictions on funding. Although light rail operations expenses are eligible for STIF formula funding, light rail capital expenses are never eligible. And finally, STIF funds are not to be used to supplant a local or regional funding source, so not to replace one of those sources of funding for public transportation services if it already exists. Next slide, please. So these are, I guess, the key upcoming dates for the funding cycle. As you can see, one of those is passed. The solicitation did open and the applications were made available on August 27th. The next two dates to remember are September 25th and December 3rd. Those are the drop-in Q&A sessions. So if you have additional questions after today's training, please come to the session on the 25th. And if you have questions as you're perhaps deep into developing your plan and getting close to the deadline, come to the session on the 3rd. Then you can see the due date of January 16th. That's when applications must be submitted. Our review process, which is complete on March 3rd, and then their dates for expected recommendation by PTAC, OTC approval of plans, which will be at their May meeting, we anticipate in 2025, and the beginning of funding disbursements. Next slide, please. So we're now going to move into a walkthrough of the STIF plan form. Just to make sure everybody is aware, unlike the STIF discretionary and STN applications, the STIF plan is not moving into Optus. I'm not moving into Optus, and it will remain a Cognito form. There are some changes to that form that we're going to emphasize in our walkthrough. One change that'll be immediately obvious, although is challenging to capture in the screenshots we're relying on, is that the application is now just one page. So previously, you had to fill out each section of the application before you could move on to the next. That's not the case anymore. And we've made some additional changes to the way the application is set up to hopefully improve the navigation for users. And with that, I'll pass over to Angie for the walkthrough of the application.
Thank you. Next slide, please. Okay, you can find the application. As Ben mentioned, it is a Cognito form. The application is available on the PTD funding website. It is also a hyperlink in the GovDelivery announcement that went out in August. In that Gov Delivery announcement was also the hyperlink to the instructions, which you should rely on to complete your application, and the STIF guidebook. Next slide, please. Okay. Please remember, when you first open your STIF application and every time that you make changes to it, you need to save your application. So you will scroll down to the bottom of the page, click save. That will create a hyperlink that you are able to access your application throughout the progress. If you do not save your application, your progress will not be saved. Unfortunately, there is no way to save it. There's no auto feature in Cognito, so we're not able to do that for you. You have to remember to save. Next slide, please. One of the first changes that you're going to see on the STIF plan when you open it is there are now show and hide features. You can choose to hide different parts of the application as you're working through it so that all of your text on the application does not appear on the screen. It makes it a lot less clunky. This is available for sections 1 through 5 as a group for each project and each task. Next slide, please. This section is where we capture the basic information about the QE. The STIF plan contact person should be the person completing the application or someone responsible for providing additional information about the plan as needed. Next slide, please. If there are subrecipients to your STIF plan, please fill out this section. You can add as many subrecipients as you need. The subrecipient field now includes nonprofit and for-profit transit provider types. This does not represent a policy change from the 23-25 solicitation, but those types of entities were previously missing, so they've been added here. Next slide, please. Here you'll be asked to affirm that you are in compliance with the advisory committee rules. You will also need to include the link or upload a copy of your advisory committee bylaws, meeting notices, and meeting minutes. If the information is not available on your website, you must demonstrate that all of the necessary information was made available to the public. In other words, you need to be able to tell us how you made that information available to the public. If you include a website link, please make sure it directs us to the page where all of the necessary materials are found. If your meeting minutes and bylaws are buried deep within your website, it takes us a long time to find what we need to confirm your eligibility or that you're in compliance. And you will more than likely end up with an email from your RTC asking you to send those documents anyway. Next slide, please. You will need to include the local plans for where each of your projects can be found. This section also allows you to either include a website or upload the plans. The only change here is to emphasize the fact that under our guidance, it is permissible to rely on one or more plans to meet the requirements in these rules. This is another change to the application, but where our policy has stayed the same, and we're just trying to make sure that the STIF plan accurately reflects our policy. Next slide, please. This section asks the QE to affirm that they are in compliance with all STIF program rules in their management of both their own funding and the funding that passed through to the subrecipients. QEs are required to monitor your subrecipient activity. Next slide, please. You're also required to affirm that you have taken the required steps to develop a sub-allocation method, and a collaborative process was used to arrive at that method. So you need to either upload that method or upload the response. Next slide, please. No changes have been made to this section. You are still required to explain how your STIF plan defines and identifies communities with a high percentage of low-income households. This definition should be in your advisory committee bylaws. Please update your bylaws if you have changed this definition. Next slide, please. QEs have the opportunity to extend the ending date of your plan into the 27-29 biennium, should you choose to do so. Make sure that you list both the date that your advisory committee recommended your STIF plan and the date that your governing body adopted your STIF plan. Note the website where the appropriate plan is posted, or attach it if it's not on your STIF website. If the governing body modified the plan after the advisory committee recommendations, please mark yes and explain why. Next slide, please. You now have the option to upload your subrecipient project applications instead of retyping all of the information. Next slide, please. If you have chosen the optional subrecipient project application form for one or more of your subrecipients, this is where you will upload each of those applications. Please remember, you will also need to copy the totals from the subrecipient project application into the fields displayed here. If you do not include this information, the calculations for your STIF plan totals will not work correctly. Next slide, please. Once you have entered more than one project, you are able to hide previous projects and make the completing of the application easier. For each project, you will enter the QE or subrecipient name, the project name, and project description. It's also important to note that if you mark hide in the project visibility or task, you must mark show before you submit the application. Next slide, please. So this slide has changed a little bit from the 23-25 cycle. On the last application, the question read, do you plan to expend funding in a future STIF plan period? We've made some edits to the language to capture the intent of that question a little bit better. This relates to projects where you're planning in advance to carry forward funding you receive in this plan period for a future plan period. Next slide, please. Okay, we're required by rule to ask a little bit more information if you're planning to carry funding forward to either accumulate sufficient funds for a capital project that can be funded in a single STIF formula funding cycle, or to make bond payments on capital assets. If you are doing one of those two things, you need to describe that capital project or asset and tell us over what period of time you're planning to spend those funds. Then you select your spending categories and you provide the dollar amount. If you're not doing that with the funding that you're planning to carry forward, you just need to select the spending categories and provide the dollar amount. Please keep in mind here that what you factored into your plan 25-27 maximum, because even though you may be spending the money for a future biennium, you're still receiving it during this biennium. If you have other unplanned or unexpected carry forward, that can be used for any project. So again, the money that you're planning to carry forward from this plan to another plan is still factored into what you're receiving this biennium towards your plan maximum. Next slide, please. If your project involves money that you're going to be spending in the 25-27 biennium, you'll start by answering these questions. Please make sure to note the local plan and page number where that project can be found for easy reference. This will make the lives of the people reading these so much easier. Next slide, please. Okay, if this project will be a multi-phase project that extends past the 25-27 biennium, it's really important to answer all of the questions in this section, including what phase of the project is being funded by this current STIF plan. If in the 23-25 STIF plan, you reported that you were going to be expending funds in a future plan, you must look at your 23-25 plan and use the money in the manner that you stated in that plan. If you have other unplanned or unexpected carry forward, that money can be used for any project. Next slide, please. One change that you will see here is that when you add a task description, you now select whether that project is supporting services for older adults and people with disabilities. This was previously, this was previously an outcome measure in the outcome measure portion of the plan, but it has been moved here to make it a little easier to track which projects support these kind of services and which do not. If you are writing a program reserve task, make sure that your task description is flexible enough to capture the variety in different spending categories for which you might want to use the program reserve funding. If you don't describe what the program reserve will be used for, it could result in a rejection of the request to move that money to another task for use. Next slide, please. Here you'll tell us if this is a pedestrian or bicycle project. Please remember that these projects are eligible if they meet the standard that we discussed in the earlier eligibility section. Next slide, please. While you're able to have multiple tasks for each project, you're only able to have one spending category per task. This is no change from previous applications. Next slide. There are a couple of changes to this. First, in response to feedback that we've received, we've broken out the STIF funding lines between population and payroll-based funds. If you're programming population funds into a task, it must be a task that provides services to older adults and people with disabilities. Also note there is no longer a line for prior biennia program reserves. Those funds should be included in your prior biennia STIF funds and can be programmed into your plan to fund any type of task. We also tried to give a little more guidance on what to do if you're using your STIF formula funds or match for another funding source. So there's a box that you can check at the bottom, and you can also include the funding source you're matching with the STIF formula funds in either the federal, other state, local, or other funds lines of the table. Next slide, please. The outcome measure section was changed to make the outcome measures for the projects they support for support of transportation of older adults and people with disabilities to make that more standardized. Instead of a completely open field where you set any measure, you will now set measures for miles, hours, rides, and rides in your operational tasks. And when you select from the other menu, the other measures of the menu for other types of tasks, you will be asked to provide data as well. Please select outcome measures appropriate for your projects as you were required to report on the progress of the outcome measures in your SPRs. More than one outcome measure can be selected per project. Next slide, please. The minimum required outcome measures for operational tasks must include the information on this slide. You will be unable to proceed without answering these questions. Next slide, please. Thank you. This portion of the plan is unchanged, but there's one thing we wanted to emphasize here concerning STIF criterion 8. That's for services for older adults and people with disabilities. The percentages that you put in this line will still be used to calculate the total amount of funding that you've devoted to those services. The population line of the expenditure estimate table does not change the way this works. So please make sure you're still using the percentage in criterion 8 to demonstrate that you're spending an adequate amount of money on those services. If that total is too low, we will have to follow up with you about your plan. Next slide, please. Okay, your project must include an Oregon Public Transportation Plan goal. So please take a moment to review the OPTP so that you are accurately selecting goals for your project. Goal progress is also reported on, and you're able to click on the hyperlink in the application to access the OPTP. Next slide, please. Your project summary will include all previous financial data that you entered for that project. Funds supporting student transportation and older and disabled persons transportation has been called out for each project to make that a little easier in tracking in your plan. Next slide, please. As in previous grant cycles, the STIF plan summary pulls together all of the information that you have entered across all of your projects. If your plan does not support the 1% student transportation, you must explain why. Next page, please, or slide. Thank you. The STIF plan signature process remains the same as in previous grant cycles. You will have the person with signature authority sign and upload the document to the plan. You can click on the hyperlink to access the signature page. Next slide. Okay, please remember, save your plan often. If you don't save and you walk away and it closes for some reason, you'll have to re-enter all that data. Make sure that you click on Submit STIF Plan when you're complete. And as with previous grant cycles, once your plan is approved by the OTC and executed by ODOT, this STIF plan becomes your grant agreement. You will not receive an additional or separate grant agreement for signature. This is your grant agreement. You're also responsible to keep a copy of your STIF plan, and you need to review that periodically for consistent spending. And with that, I will turn it back to Ben.
Thank you. So now we'll talk a little bit about our review process. So generally, the review process for STIF plans has not changed. We will first do what's called a completeness review. So what we are looking at is to make sure that all of the required information for the STIF plan has been provided. If there are issues in your plan, we will reach out and ask for missing information or clarifications to try to get those issues squared away and corrected before we need to submit the plans to PTAC. Once we have determined that your plan is complete, we will submit it to PTAC for review. PTAC will review the plans under the criteria for provided by the OTC and by rule, and make a determination on whether they should be recommended for approval by the OTC. After PTAC is done, they then forward the plans to OTC along with their recommendation, who will review and determine whether to approve or reject each plan. If a STIF plan is rejected, there is an opportunity for appeal. Next slide, please. So now we're going to move on to some points that we'd like to emphasize coming out of the presentation and a few other things to highlight. Next slide, please. So first, just to point to a couple of common mistakes we've seen in last cycles, please be sure to follow the application instructions. They're helpful, and they provide a similar walkthrough of the portions of the Cognito form that you'll fill out as we provided today. Something else we've seen and something else we're encouraging people to do is to please make sure that if you have a program reserve task, that you basically provide enough information to explain what that program reserve is for. The failure to adequately describe what it is for may result in rejection of a modification request to move funding from the program reserve to another task. So please be careful about that, and please do reach out if you have questions. For those tasks where there are outcome measures assigned, as Angie mentioned, it's really important that you select measures that match well with the task, because you'll need to report on those. And now, just to emphasize some of the key changes to the application we've already talked about, there is the show hide feature. And remember, if you have chosen to use that feature and you have hidden fields, make sure that you show those before you submit. Please keep an eye out for the change in that section related to funding your plan to carry forward. It looks a little bit different, and there is one new question. And then I'd like to emphasize once again that we have added that population funds line to the expenditure estimate table but make sure you're careful about filling out the criterion 8 of the funding allocation table, assigning those percentages for each project, because that will still be how your funding for older adults and people with disabilities is calculated. So make sure that those percentages are entered and that they are accurate. Next slide, please. A couple other things to emphasize. Making sure that required documents are readily available where linked or uploaded. I'd just like to reemphasize the physical or functional relationship test that applies to those bicycle and pedestrian projects. So the limited eligibility for those projects. If it is not, if those projects are not within the distances or not within a distance that people will travel to get to a transit stop, then they are not eligible. If they meet that test, they are. And then a couple things that have changed in the application instructions to kind of bolster those resources for folks. We have added 2 appendices. First is Appendix A. That appendix brings together and compiles the feedback we received both in writing and in our listening session on the STIF plan from 23-25. And we go through and we address each of those comments and explain the changes that we made, or in some cases, changes we did not make to the plan. We also have Appendix B. Appendix B is a glossary of the calculations in the STIF plan. So the 2 summary sections, which include several calculations in your plan, the STIF plan summary and the project summary, we now try to go through and explain what each of those calculations means, meaning where it's drawing the numbers. So please take a look at those if you have questions about how the application is arriving at a certain result. Next slide, please. Also want to emphasize that we have done an update of the guidebook and to point out a couple of the changes through there. So the STIF formula section of the guidebook has been reorganized to a significant extent to try to make it a little bit easier to follow. We have added definitions of some key terms, including carry forward, plan maximum, program reserve, and reserve payments. So please take a look at the guidebook for those definitions. And then there is a discussion of the plan amendment rule. So you may recall that there was a temporary administrative rule that allowed for some limited amendments to STIF plans to increase the plan maximum or increase the amount of prior biennial funding in the plan. And that rule is now being advanced for approval as a permanent rule with expected approval in October. And there is discussion of that rule change in the guidebook. Next slide, please. Next, a couple other things to emphasize. We are currently taking a look at the STIF program rules more generally. We're currently gathering feedback from providers through a survey and preparing for a session at the Oregon Public Transportation Conference in Seaside. So just wanted to flag for people that we are working through that process and moving ahead towards a formal rulemaking process in 2025 after the legislative session wraps up. And additionally, we're beginning a STIF process review. And if you're interested in sharing your thoughts concerning STIF processes, feel free to reach out to me, and we'll also be looking at ways to seek input. Next slide, please. Now, some opportunities for more information. There is as I've mentioned, there are the 2 upcoming drop-in Q&A sessions. One is on Wednesday, September 25th at 11 a.m. And then the next is on Tuesday, December 3rd at 2 p.m. Feel free to attend those sessions if you have questions. Highlighting again our guidebook and the application instructions. And of course, feel free to reach out to your regional transit coordinator if you have further questions for them. Finally, I would also like to highlight for everyone that there is another upcoming training on the fifth, and this one is on the 5311 and 5310 federal formula program. So that is our federal formula subrecipient training. That is on September the 18th at 11 a.m. So please, if you are a subrecipient for those funds, please do attend that training. And with that, we'll move into the question portion of the presentation. Thank you everyone for being here, and we'll do our best to answer your questions. And I see that there are some in our Q&A.
Okay, so the first question is, are local subrecipients seeking funding through the QE required to complete the ODOT application using the link, or is it optional? If they complete this application, will the information automatically update to the STIF plan application in Optus?
So the first part of that, so the application form, the subrecipient application form is optional. So it is up to so you do not have to use that form, but it is available as a tool. Now, I think Drew may be able to correct me if I misstate this, but I believe that what will happen with those is that we will then enter the information into Optus, which is how we transfer information from the Cognito forms into our Optus system. Drew, does that sound correct?
Yes, the failing of using the Cognito forms is that it requires the operations support analyst to capture the data and plug it into Optus. So that's the process.
Our next question is, will we receive a copy of the slides after this presentation?
So the slides will be posted to our formula funding or our funding opportunity webpage along with the recording. And I can, in just a moment, I'll put that link into the answer for the question.
Perfect. Then Reagan is asking, will the reporting structure in Optus remain the same for the 25-27 biennium as it was for 23-25? I'm assuming the answer is yes to that one.
There are no current plans to change the reporting structure.
Okay, perfect. Then Peggy would like to know, can the STIF formula be used to maintain a service that is not considered expanded, supplementing, not supplanting an existing funding?
Yes, so maintaining current services, maintaining is one of the I guess permissible uses of STIF funding. So that would be distinct from supplanting. So supplanting would be replacing a local or regional funding source, but maintaining current services is allowed.
Let me dive a little bit deeper into this question. So let's say you have a service that was fully funded by 5311 funds before. That service, the 5311 fund structure has changed, so it's no longer fully funded by 5311. Would they be able to pull in STIF formula for that purpose? Keeping in mind they're also still using 5311, but they would want to use STIF to maintain that service as well. Any thoughts on that?
Sorry, are you so?
I think that
Yeah,
question was for
Ryan,
you, Ben. No, I just want to make sure that you recognize that question was to you.
Yeah. Yeah, so I had missed that. Sorry, I was looking at one of the questions in the Q&A
So the question
section.
is, they have a 5311 service. 5311 structure's changed a little bit and no longer funds the entirety of that service. Now they need money from somewhere else to finish paying for that service. So would they then be able to use STIF formula funds if they had that extra to, in addition to 5311, cover the other costs of that service.
So this, I think, would likely, so supplanting funds, the statute refers specifically to local or regional agency monies. And I don't believe, so if for example, if there's a loss or a reduction of a federal funding source, I don't believe that would fit into the definition of supplanting. I think this may be one too that we'll want to look into to perhaps talk some more about at the upcoming Q&A. But that's my thinking about and looking at the statute. That is my initial inclination. If we're talking about federal money, it doesn't appear to fit that definition of supplanting.
Perfect. Okay. And the next question is, are you, I'm assuming that's ODOT, going to review the subrecipient applications?
Let's see. Drew, what has been the past practice on that?
Oh, you mean in terms of providing guidance in a meeting setting like this on how to do the subrecipient application?
No, have we so those, yeah, I think,
actually review the
yeah,
subrecipient application. And it's been my experience that no, that's the QE's responsibility
right.
to review and approve, and then the advisory committee makes a recommendation to the governing body whether or not to approve. And then the governing body has final say yes or no. But if they make changes to what the advisory committee recommends, they need to explain why they made that change. But we ourselves, as in ODOT, would not be reviewing those subrecipient applications.
Okay, yeah, now I'm understanding the question. Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you, Angie, for fielding that one. that is the those are essentially projects to the QE's governing body. It's not a separate application process.
That's the way I'm reading that question. So if I'm wrong,
Well said, Angie.
whoever typed that in, please post another question to that. Go ahead, Drew.
Oh, I was just complimenting you. That was well said, Angie.
Thank you. Okay, the next question is, and I just lost it. Will the quarterly allocation payments made by ODOT combine both population and payroll-based funds into a single payment? Previous to this last quarter, the funds were allocated in two separate payments by the funding type.
I can try to answer that. The intent is to have separate payments. I'm a little confused by the last sentence because it implies that some reason PTD did something different than the norm, which is to have separate payments. But that was my ask of operations, was that they separate the payments. I thought that there would be less confusion for the QE in doing so. And it has proven to be helpful when I'm going through the Secretary of State audits and the ODOT internal audit team, and they're trying to look at our payments. Separating those out has proven to be a good idea. So I don't understand the benefit of putting them together. My intent is to have them separate.
Okay, the next question is, given the local subrecipient app link is public, will the QE receive a notification email when the application is submitted? So in other words, is the QE, if they have a subrecipient submitting the document, going to receive an email that they have a subrecipient application to their main STIF formula? I would assume the answer is yes on that. That the QE will somehow be notified that a subrecipient has submitted an application. Would that be correct?
been in the past, yes.
Yeah, I believe that is correct. I'll confirm with Brian and make sure. But that has been how it's worked in the past.
Okay, and someone posted, yes, guidance on the subrecipient application. Not quite sure what that means. So if you could give us a little bit more detail on what you're referring to there, that would be very helpful. Then Sarah says, although Drew answered the question Drew asked is a good one, do subrecipients get any specific training? Is that in relation to the application? If so, this was the training in addition to the instruction book and the guidebook. Is that correct, Drew?
Well, I think our focus has been primarily on the QE plan document. So I guess the question may be, what's different in the subrecipient application that we need to advise people about? I mean, if there's something inherently different about the subrecipient application that we need to let folks know, can we address that in the next session we're having at the end of September?
Yeah, I will think about how to address that. I think just for information, the subrecipient project application and the STIF plan largely mirror each other. So the information you enter about projects in the subrecipient application looks just like the information you enter about projects in the STIF plan itself. So those are designed to match each other. But that's a good question and something I'll look at for the Q&A.
And Reagan had her hand up. Are you still wanting to talk, Reagan? Okay. If you change your mind, just pop back on and we'll give you the floor for a moment. So this, I think, is a follow-up to the yes guidance on subrecipient question. The question was how to complete the application, walk through the functions of the application for the subrecipient. It's going to be very similar to what the QE does. Very similar. You still have to complete all of the information, including project details, outcome measures, the OPTP goals. It'll be very similar, but this would be a good time to reach out to your RTC and to come to the Q&A session on September 25th. Okay, Eddie asks, the funding forecast for the upcoming biennium is 243 million. Is that less than forecasted? Is this less than the forecasted funds in the current biennium? And what is that attributed to? Just decreased payroll funds or collection?
I can try to answer that question. So the August 24 allocated disbursement estimate was based on a number of factors. The most important was the April 2024 Department of Revenue estimate. PTD will get another estimate from the Department of Revenue in mid-October. Our assigned ODOT economist believes that the upcoming October 24 estimated revenue numbers from the Department of Revenue may be higher. The soonest PTD staff will have converted this future data into revised estimates for each QE will be the latter half of October. That may be coming too late for some QAs to take into account. For this reason, PTD is recommending the qualifying entities add a 20% contingency onto the August 24 PTD published estimate in their 25-27 STIF formula plans.
Okay, thank you. Brittany asks, if you're a private nonprofit and are not considered an eligible recipient and just contract to carry out the STIF projects, Is it allowed for the nonprofit to utilize the subrecipient application similar to an eligible subrecipient, or should the QE just submit the STIF application only? So this is for purchase services.
Yeah, so I don't, so if you're contracting rather than receiving funds as a subrecipient, I don't believe the subrecipient application would be appropriate. I would say though that nonprofits can be subrecipients under STIF plans. They're not eligible to apply to ODOT or submit a STIF plan to ODOT, but could have a project within a QE STIF plan. But whether to contract or whether to I guess have a project within a plan is, you know, up to the agencies involved.
And then Charlene is asking if there is a STIF plan is there a STIF plan template and a subrecipient application available for reference?
So we don't have one ready to, like, we don't have I guess a pre-made PDF. You can generate a PDF with the control or with print to PDF function out of the Cognito form. And if that doesn't work for you, please feel free to reach out to me or to Brian, and we may be able to provide some additional assistance.
Hey, Reagan, if you're still online, go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Thank you. I just wanted to circle back to the conversation you were having about the optional subrecipient application. You mentioned that they basically mirror the STIF plan application that you've already walked through. Does that mean that people who are using the optional subrecipient application can enter multiple projects on the same application, or would they need to do a new application per project?
They can enter multiple projects. So you can add projects and add tasks within projects like you can within the STIF plan itself.
Great, thank you. Feel free to mute me again.
Okay. Then we go over to the chat, and there were a couple of questions put in the chat. So one says, we anticipate being a subrecipient. Will we get details about applying for the funds from the QE? Or should we proactively fill out the subrecipient form and get it to the qualified entity?
So I think that would typically be something that you would decide with your qualified entity, keeping in mind that the projects have to go to the qualified entity's STIF advisory committee and then be approved by the governing body. Does that, Drew, I see you unmuted. Does that sound correct?
Well, I guess my suggestion would be if there's a subrecipient that's is unsure of the process and unsure what they ought to do, my suggestion would be reach out to the regional transit coordinator. I think our RTCs do a great job of helping entities through this complicated process. And I think the RTCs can be a valuable resource.
Looks like we have one final question from Cynthia, and Ben, I'm going to throw this one to you. So where can I learn about how the outcome measures are used by the state?
So that is a good question. So the outcome measures and that our plan, in the STIF plan, are essentially things we're tracking year over year. And many of them are things that are related to outcomes that we're required to track by statute or by rule. I think this is also one where because we're running out of time, I may have to I guess, spend some more time and provide some more input on this at our next session or in between. But thank you for the question. It is a good question.
What I can say is that we aggregate all of the anticipated outcomes into the report that goes to the Oregon Transportation Commission, but when they are determining whether they're going to approve the plans. So in many of the tables that are provided to the OTC, we're taking those outcome measures from all of the plans, aggregating them up together and providing them to the OTC, which we're required as an agency to provide the OTC.
We also use data that we get from reports, both APRs and SPRs, to provide information to the legislators as we're providing an update on our programs and plans and projects that we have going on.
Okay, we have another question. Sometimes it's confusing how to report on the outcome measures quarterly. It is easier when projecting it for a full year, but quarterly is more difficult. This may require a longer discussion. You are correct, Cynthia. This will require a longer discussion that maybe we can talk about on the 25th. And Ben, I think that's the last of the questions.
Great. And I can, so it looks like we also, it looks like, yeah, there was the earlier question about the subrecipient application link that Brian was able to answer or confirm the answer in the Q&A. So just bringing that to folks' attention. Well, thank you everyone so much for coming to our training today. And yeah, we hope to see you again in 2 weeks.